From having John Jones test positive for steroids, which led to a 4-year suspension, to Conor McGregor insulting Khabib Nurmagomedov's wife and mocking the death of his father, UFC rivalries are known to be absolutely brutal. At the same time, they're pretty important for the sport. I mean, whatever sport it may be, every fan needs a team they like to cheer for. On the other hand, they've also got a team or player they can't stand. And that's when bitter rivalries like these take your emotions on an all-time high, to the point that every moment that ticks by is super important, because it can change the entire game. In a way, rivalries sort of shape the culture of a sport, or at least that's what it did for the UFC. For starters, they keep fans emotionally invested in whatever's going on, because now it's not just another fight. And rivalry bouts take it one step further. If fans are ready to tune in to see some action, I don't think Dana White's gonna be complaining when these rivalries are boosting sales like crazy. Not to mention, they also add to the history of the sport, because in one way or another, some of them add to the legacy of individual fighters as well, turning them into instant classics. On top of that, rivalries are pretty great for the fighters too, because the hatred sort of becomes a source of motivation for them. They take their fights a lot more seriously and train harder than they would have. And that's also why the final fight is a lot more intense too. All in all, rivalries make the sport a lot more interesting. And I'm pretty sure you're gonna agree with me, because the first one on the list lasted longer than you think. TJ Dillashaw and Cody Garbrandt are known for one of the longest UFC rivalries ever. That's right, it seemed like they were neck to neck for decades on end, even though their actual fights lasted about 11 minutes and 51 seconds only. Having said that, the actual rivalry started years before the fight. I'm talking about the time when they started off as teammates with the Team Alpha Male, or TAM for short. Although it didn't take long before TJ stepped out the door, thanks to his working relationship with deposed coach Dwayne Ludwig. And with that, he made his way to the Octagon debut about 8 months later. Not only that, but the split became official in October 2015, after which Dominic Cruz beat him in January 2016. And that's when TAM's new and upcoming star, Cody, moved up the ladder to his initial title shot to win from Cruz the same year. With that said, the hype for a grudge title match began for TJ, who needed to redeem himself. And from there, fans got claims for sparring match knockouts on one side to training camp insults on the other. It went on for quite a while, until the two rivals finally met in the ring back in November 2017 at UFC 217. That's where TJ survived an exciting first round, leading to a stoppage of Cody about halfway through round 2. Fast forward to a rematch at UFC 227 in August 2018, and it was the same thing all over again. It seemed like TJ ended the rivalry with a first round knockout in only 4 minutes and 10 seconds. But this was all for a title. TJ just wanted to redeem himself. Meanwhile, the next one on the list was heated thanks to a couple of things outside the ring. Anderson Silva and Chael Sonnen's trash talk only got worse. I mean, even though Sonnen wasn't really as skilled as his rival, that didn't stop him from earning himself the first date with the UFC middleweight champion at UFC 117. But this was over a decade ago, in August 2010. Back then, Sonnen suddenly became a world-class trash talker and did enough talking for the two of them. In fact, he even mentioned that he didn't really have any reason to hate him, but it's just how things are anyway. As for Silva's pristine aura at 185 pounds, he claimed that he wasn't legit either, thanks to the doubtful opposition. And all of this wasn't directed at Silva only, but the entire country of Brazil. Having said that, all of this trash talk lasted right until their first meeting beating in the ring. That's when Silva destroyed him with a triangle choke in the final round, which allowed the fighter to keep his belted status. But since Sonnen was dominating his rival right until the miraculous win, fans wanted a rematch. But he'd also end up testing positive for elevated testosterone levels after the fight, and it would be suspended. At the same time, that began a pattern of Sonnen trash-talking right until the rematch 2 years later, where he bowed out early in round 2 itself. Next up on the list is definitely one of the greatest rivalries in the history of the sport: Jon Jones versus Daniel Cormier. It all started back when Jones jokingly said that he could take the Olympian down, right in the middle of their first ever meetup. And of course, Daniel wasn't really gonna let that comment slide. In fact, he said that Jones went as far as insulting and threatening him. This went on until the two finally met face to face again, when Daniel stepped in as a replacement to share the ring with his rival at UFC 178. While Jones would bump his head against him, he'd push back the fighter by the throat. And after that, Jones literally threw his belt on the ground and went on to cause all that chaos on stage. Eventually, they met again, but in a different pay-per-view, since he was pulled out because of a torn meniscus, only to win in a unanimous decision. But this wasn't the end of it. He had a lot of things going on outside the cage too, and I'm talking about some intense stuff like hit and run convictions and a bunch of failed PED tests. Not only that, but right before his fight with Daniel, the UFC was getting suspicious about steroid use. They were supposed to meet at UFC 200, but they didn't. Instead, Jones tested positive for steroids. Because of this, the fight was called off and he was suspended for a year. Eventually, they met again in UFC 214, and Jones won by knockout, only to have his victory overturned to a no contest. On top of that, he tested positive for steroids again, and that meant a 4-year suspension this time. Needless to say, throughout all of this, there was a lot of back and forth on social media between the two, up until the point where he was accused of using steroids throughout his career. Moving on to the last one on the list. One of them got a little too personal. Conor McGregor and Khabib Nurmagomedov's rivalry began in the UFC lightweight division, and leading to talks regarding the potential matchup, the Russian Hammer offered his unfiltered thoughts, calling his rival a coward. In fact, he said that it takes one minor injury in training for him to step down. But of course, that didn't sit well with him. Instead, the Eagle confronted and slapped Lobov at the Fighter Hotel. Let's just say the Irishman's bus attack was the catalyst for the fight that took place at UFC 229, where the Eagle took the win. But that didn't end the social media trash talk. I mean, Conor went as far as insulting Khabib's wife and even mocking the death of his father. Yep, that's how personal these rivalries can be. Having said that, these were the most unforgettable UFC rivalries that defined a generation.